Okay, so the question that you're asked to work on right now is that you need to compare two food production systems. The two that you compare need to differ in at least one of the following, either subsistence versus commercial or intensive versus extensive. Um, Now, let's kind of unpack this question a little bit. First of all, food production systems, what are they? And then we're going to kind of define subsistence, commercial, and intensive versus extensive so you can get some ideas about where you might want to look. All right. So, in food production systems, essentially what they are is food production systems are any systems that's going to supply food. Okay. Um, And that's going to include inputs and outputs. So, inputs, if we're thinking about something like this where we've got a lot of crops, you're going to have inputs, of course, of sunlight and water, and it could be fertilizer and time and labor and money. So the inputs might be biological or ecological in nature, or they could be on the social side of things, the labor that gets put in, the workers, the gas, the equipment needed. Okay, and then the outputs, of course, will be the food that it might be producing, but the outputs are also going to be things like could be pollution, it could be pesticides, a number of different things. It could be money if you're growing the crops for cash. So the inputs again and the outputs, they can be either biological, natural in nature, or it can be on the social side of things. Okay, so it can be on the ecosystems or on the societies. And different food production systems have characteristics that kind of help define them. And there's going to be both environmental and socioeconomic factors that are involved. So, what type of food production systems that a society is going to choose, that's going to be based on a number of factors. One of the big things is what's the climate, right? You're not exactly going to be growing a whole lot of bananas here in the Czech Republic. The climate just doesn't support it. It's not warm enough. We've got winters. So the climate is going to be one factor about what types of things are going to be grown where. And of course, culture and religion. What are people's food preferences? If it's not a heavy meat eating society, they're probably not going to have a lot of animal based pastoral type things. So what gets eaten is also based on culture, or what gets grown. And of course, there's politics. Is the government putting money into certain things, like with a lot of the rapeseed that gets grown to create fuel? There's a lot of subsidies there. In North America, corn is a very heavily subsidized crop, and so a lot of corn is going to get grown because the government many years ago in the United States really invested a lot of money into growing corn for a number of different reasons. And then, of course, there's socioeconomic factors, just depending on, do you have enough money to be able to put together some of the large, more agribusiness type crops, or are you going to be more focused on just being able to feed yourself and your family? So there's a lot of different things that go into what type, a lot of inputs that is going to decide what type of crop is going to be grown, or if it's going to be, it could be animal farming as well. Okay, so further unpacking the questions. So you're going to pick, as I said, two farming systems. And those two farming systems need to contrast in some way. So they can either contrast on subsistence versus commercial, or extensive versus intensive. So this is vocabulary that you actually need to be comfortable with using when you're describing a food production system. And here's a few other words: pastoral, arable, or mixed. But first, let's focus on subsistence versus commercial. So what subsistence farming means is that it is basically the family grows enough food to feed itself, or it could be a few families together growing enough food, and that farm is specifically there to provide sustenance for the family that's growing it. Whereas a commercial farm is going to be a larger farm that is meant to produce enough goods that are going to be sold at market. So it could be large agribusiness or some sort of cash cropping. So you can see this example here on the right. That's obviously way more wheat than any one family is going to eat. And so that is something that is being harvested to be able to sell and make money. Some cash cropping, typical cash crops would include, all the rapeseed that we see outside here, the wheat we see here, large cornfields, and you can also see a lot of cash cropping in places in Africa. So, like growing coffee can be a major cash crop, right? Or cocoa beans or something like that, where you're growing things that aren't necessarily to feed your family, but you can make some good money on it. Okay, so subsistence, you can see it's probably going to have a whole bunch of different things that are growing here because you're going to eat more than one thing, and it's simply to feed the family. So you can see this is an example of subsistence because there's just different types of food being grown. There's a lot of different ways to do this. There could be animals here as well, but subsistence farming is to be able to support the family or a group of families, whereas commercial farming, the intent is to make money. Usually it's one large crop that's being grown. Now, extensive versus intensive has to do with how much energy you put into the land, essentially, or how you're putting it together. So, extensive. The comparisons here I'm going to show you is an extensive, like Maasai farming. So, Maasai farming of cattle. They roam a lot and take large amounts of pasture land. So they kind of move their cows from one area to another. They don't provide the food for the cows. They just move them into the savannah so they can get the food that the cows need. Okay, so it's extensive. It takes a lot of land without a ton of like individual input effort. Whereas intensive is going to be, it's usually in a smaller area of land, and there's a lot of energy and input put in to get a lot more out of it. So the amount of land and energy, the amount of land is smaller, but the amount of energy and all those things that you need to put into it is a lot more intensive. If you're looking at crops for this and not just animals, like if you think about in the Netherlands, when you are flying over, you see all those greenhouses. That is pretty intensive, right? You're growing a whole bunch of crops within these greenhouses in an intense space. You put in a lot of work and money and effort and labor. Okay. Whereas if you're growing crops where it's kind of out there, they're rain fed, it doesn't take a whole lot of labor. Kind of, the fields that we have outside here actually don't take a lot of labor because you don't need any irrigation. Nobody's really tending to them except for occasionally the tractor comes through. But if you're growing in a greenhouse, there's a lot of labor and a lot of intensity happening. So extensive, not so much labor, but lots of land. Okay. Intensive, lots of labor, not so much land. So there's kind of trade-offs, right? And then this last bit of pastoral, arable, or mixed. So pastoral means you're raising animals, and then arable means you're raising plants. It's like crops. So any farm can be all these. Now, these you aren't going to be using one of these as your possible comparisons, but it's a nice bit of vocabulary that you should be familiar with. Okay, so you're going to pick two farming systems: subsistence versus commercial, or extensive versus intensive. Good luck.